My name is Rachel Oswald. I cover foreign policy from Capitol Hill for CQ Roll Call, something I've been doing for 5 years. To my immediate left is Sheikh Abdullah Ali Al-Sabah. He will be giving us remarks about Russia and how Russia affects foreign policy in the Gulf. His background is he has an MA in International Relations from Kuwait University, and he has written extensively about the geopolitics of the Gulf region, including his most recent publication, The Strategic Rise of Russia and Its Impact on International Balances. To my immediate right is Professor Stephen Simon. He is a professor of practice of international relations after serving as the National Security Council Senior Director for Counterterrorism in the Clinton White House, as well as positions on the Middle East and North Africa in the Obama White House. Professor Simon will be speaking about how he will be discussing tensions between Congress and the Gulf. I think it can't be underlined enough that Congress and the Trump administration are increasingly diverging when it comes to the Gulf politics, so it's useful for practitioners to bear that in mind. And then to my far right is Khalil Jassan, the executive director of the Arab Center. He will be giving remarks about how Gulf countries perceive U.S. policy. And so just to start it off at the top and set the table for us a little bit, I'm really glad that they decided to include a panel in today's conference on Congress in the Gulf because particularly under President Donald Trump, we have seen Congress kind of reawakening after decades of kind of acquiescing to foreign policy moves during the Bush and Obama administrations. We've seen Congress trying to claw back some of the prerogatives that the Constitution gives it with things like funding and treaties. So particularly after the House was won by Democrats after the 2018 midterms, we have seen that divergence in policy heightened so far this year. The number of bills and resolutions where Congress is trying to reassert itself on foreign policy and throw a wrench in the gears toward the Trump administration's policy to the Gulf states are many, and I'll just highlight a few of them. Congress passed this year and the president vetoed a trio of resolutions disapproving of weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But I would expect Senate action as soon as this year to tighten a loophole that allows the State Department to declare an emergency situation and bypass congressional oversight with arms sales. The Secretary of State did that controversially with Saudi Arabia and UAE this year, so I would expect action on that. We have, every year, Congress passes an annual defense policy bill. Both the House and the Senate have their own versions. They are at the close to the winding down deliberations on that final compromise bill, but there are a number of points where they diverge on Gulf, and those include the House bill would prohibit the President Donald Trump from launching an attack on Iran without congressional authorization. The House bill would prohibit support for the Saudi-led coalition's war fight in Yemen, and there are others. Looking through my notes now, the House bill would limit the administration's ability to transfer arms to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The Senate bill would not. And the House bill would repeal the 2002 authorization for use of military force in Iraq, and the Senate bill would not do that. So depending on how deliberations go on this final bill, we could see further restrictions put on the Trump administration's ability to maneuver in the Gulf. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill are increasingly concerned about the breakdown among GCC countries between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and more recently, signs of divergence between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. One influential voice for Democrats on foreign policy, Christopher Murphy, a senator from Connecticut, yesterday in a Senate floor speech said, The conflict has raged on for so long due to Trump's unwillingness to use America's diplomatic muscle that events on the ground became so chaotic that the Saudis and the Emiratis have now parted ways. Now with the Qataris, the Saudis, and the Emiratis all on different wavelengths, the potential for proxy wars between these wealthy nations could get much worse all over the Middle East. So ways that Congress can insert itself on foreign policy include the imposition of sanctions. We're seeing that happening this week with the development of a number of bills that would impose sanctions on Turkey. And action on that is still unfolding. Other ways Congress can insert itself on foreign policy include prohibiting the sale of weapons to Gulf countries, which we know that they have traditionally been dependent upon and much of their infrastructure rely on, even as they may seek to develop other defense suppliers from Russia and China. So with that, I think I'll turn it to our panelists for remarks on the situation with Congress and the Gulf, first with Professor Stephen Simon.
Thank you. That was a really great wrap-up of the state of play right now. So maybe what I'll do is, bearing in mind that we want to keep the comments short, is just put it in historical perspective. And just to be concise, I'm not going to go farther back than the Adams administration and the debate in Congress then about funding a Navy for use in the Barbary Wars against the regents in North Africa. Is that okay? Yeah, no, really, I'm just going to go back to 1981, which for most of us is ancient history. Because I think it's important to address the question, how crucial is Congress really anyway in this domain? Before we start worrying about the impact of tensions that may or may not exist between Congress and the White House at this point. Congress has had, with respect to the Persian Gulf, some, seriously influential moments. In 1981, to go back to that year, the Reagan administration was brand new. They came in, they wanted to sell AWACS to Saudi Arabia. That didn't work out that well. And the thing is, the language deployed regarding Saudi Arabia is a lot like what you hear now, actually. So the late Senator Kennedy said this is one of the worst and most dangerous arms sales ever. Senator Regal said, we are being asked to submit to a kind of blackmail, the price gouging of oil. It's a bit of a non sequitur, but I guess it was the best he could come up with at the moment. But Bob Packwood, who is a very important Democrat in those days, said that the Saudis have displayed a hostility that must be interpreted as their deliberate intentions to promote continued instability in the Middle East. He said, let's think about which nations have been seriously committed to negotiating peace in the Middle East and which have not shared that commitment. And Saudi Arabia was in the category of not sharing it. Then the administration made a second go in September '85 to sell 40 F-15s. And some of us in the room will remember that, that drama pretty well. It worked out great for the United Kingdom. Not so great for the United States because Congress put a serious restriction on the deployment of F-15s within the kingdom, prohibiting their deployment to Tabuk, which is within range of Israel for Saudi planes that might be staging from there. So the Brits jumped in and with the Al Yamama deal and sold a lot of Tornado aircraft. But the real drama for Congress begins in January 1991. So after 3 days of debate, and there's some really interesting speeches that were made in that time frame, especially by Steve Solars. I don't know, some of you may remember him. The Senate approved the use of military force by a vote of 52 to 47. I mean, it was more comfortable in the House for the Bush administration, but the Senate was really close. And there's, I think, a pretty good example of Congress exerting influence on the process of a really historic nature. Because when you think of what the Middle East might look like if Congress, if the Senate, had beat down that war resolution, the Middle East and the United States would both look very different today. This thing happened all over again in 2002. There, the votes were a little bit different, but equally consequential. It was the resolution in favor of using military force against Iraq in the post-9/11 timeframe, and that was in November 2002. There, the Democrats in the House were very unhappy with it. And they were grudging in their support in terms of the numbers. In the Senate, things were a little bit different, but the Democrats were divided almost down the middle, while the Republicans were very much in favor of the vote. And then the Iran deal was another example of a consequential congressional action. Now, it wasn't durable because there was a transfer of power to the opposition party, which discarded the agreement that Congress had not, of which Congress had not disapproved, I think is the technical way to do it. So some really consequential things there. So we know Congress can be quite important. Okay, we also know that regional countries spend a lot of money and expend a lot of effort in the United States to influence congressional opinion, presumably in the belief that Congress is important when it comes to shaping options, if nothing else, for the executive branch, for the White House in particular. So the UAE, according to the Center for International Policy, employs 20 different firms as registered foreign agents in the United States, has paid $20 million to those firms. Those firms carried out almost 3,200 political activities, most of which are congressional contacts of one kind or another. The UAE foreign agents contacted more than 200 congressional offices, in addition to a range of think tanks and so forth. And the firms employed by the UAE made about $600,000 in campaign contributions. So there's some skin in the game here. On the Saudi side of things, 31 different firms served as Saudi Arabia's registered foreign agents in the United States. They spent about $15 million. They had, and for that money, there were 2,000 political activities done on Saudi Arabia's behalf. Saudi lobbyists contacted the office of nearly every senator and more than 200 representatives. And these firms made $2.2 million in campaign contributions. So clearly these Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, think it's important to influence Congress. Now, the issues that are now in play, arms sales for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, support for the Yemen operation, all against the backdrop of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul, are what we're looking at against this background. The Yemen resolution, I think, will just die in committee. And Trump, as noted, had vetoed the resolution of disapproval for the Saudi UAE $8 billion package. So the question is what these recent developments mean in the context of executive-legislative relations. It's not an easy question because it relates to the nature of public opinion and in its relationship to foreign policy and how members of Congress respond to these things. Social science and common sense converge on the observation that most Americans know nothing about foreign affairs and don't care about it. Okay, I think we all agree on that. In fact, we may be the only ones who care very much. Asking them what U.S. policy should be towards Turkey, Syria, or the Kurds mostly gets you nonsense answers. From a social science perspective, there's nothing even to measure there. Okay, so given that constituents mostly don't care, this frees members of Congress to take whatever positions they want or none. Now, the press coverage of Syria withdrawal has been very negative: betrayed allies, massacres, refugees, and so forth. So to the extent voters are paying attention, which isn't much, they'll tend to move in a negative way. But this isn't decisive. The big exception to don't know, don't care are groups that have a strong attachment to pet countries. Okay, and we know who those are. Jews in Israel, Irish Americans in Ireland, Italian Americans in Italy, Mexican Americans in Mexico. The two world wars, interestingly, disassociated German Americans from Germany. They just couldn't, it wasn't politic to make that, connection. So we're dealing with a kind of a different animal here, because there aren't those kinds of affinity groups between, say, the Kurds or the Gulf Arabs and the United States, and groups within the United States, ethnic groups or whatever. So what happens is, on these issues is, people say the mean is low, but the variance is high. So there's very little interest generally, but where there is interest, it spikes. And we can look at that spike and be misled into thinking that somehow it signifies that the mean is actually higher than it is. Maybe if the news showed the president kicking a dog, you might get a somewhat more, durable result, but that's not the case. So anyway.
Or an old lady.
Or an old lady, or shooting somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue.
There you go.
So the upshot is that the president's extreme favorability with Republican voters on key issues, especially cultural ones, and the fear and deference this induces in Republican members of Congress doesn't carry over into foreign affairs. So Republican members of Congress can condemn him and not worry about a primary challenge as a result. This would not be true if they came out, for against impeachment or against the wall, or, for impeachment or against the wall. Okay, says that the question of money, and social scientists have looked at this quite a bit, and I'll just give you the bottom line, which is there are no reliable conclusions as to whether it buys influence. Okay, what it buys is access and time spent discussing an issue, but it doesn't guarantee influence. It just doesn't work like that, at least as far as social science is concerned. So on net, to conclude, should we care about all this? Yes, but not too much, I guess, is my conclusion. First, impeachment will swamp this. Interest in Syria will deflate over time. Despite the growing sense that oil isn't that important anymore, Saudi Arabia and UAE remain enormous producers. You can't get around that. Business interests are therefore quite thick. The UAE, in any case, is not really controversial. This is about Saudi Arabia. And, as far as I could see, if Mohammed bin Salman doesn't misstep, if talks proceed in Yemen, the administration will have the means to push back against punitive congressional actions and plenty of talking points to push back. For example, to your point, concern about pushing the Saudis into Russia's arms or something like that. I mean, you could, and in fact, many of us have written these talking points in our sleep. So you can just imagine, what they would be. They're easy to conjure. Anyway, that's my bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Khalil, can you please take it from here on the reception of U.S. policy coming from Washington and the Gulf?
All right. Good evening, everybody. And congratulations. You are the most resilient of the several hundred people who have participated in this conference, having lasted that long. And being, I think my count is the 34th speaker since 9 o'clock this morning. I feel like Elizabeth Taylor's 8th husband. I don't know what I could add to the equation here, but I'll give it a try. So thank you for being here. I was asked to actually talk a little bit about the reception or the receptivity in the Gulf for U.S. policy in terms of the administration. My immediate reaction was twofold. What policy? Two, which country in the Gulf? Because actually to talk about the Gulf at this stage of the GCC crisis, there is no unified position, not on Iran and definitely not on Mr. Trump and his policies. So my remarks are based on 40 years of experience dealing with the Gulf as an Arab American activist, focusing career-wise on improving U.S.-Arab relations. I've dealt with at least 48 Arab leaders during that period where I worked on lobbying on behalf of Arab Americans, and including several heads of state today and foreign ministers and prime ministers, emirs, and what have you. So based on that, I will try to kind of give you an idea of the general reaction. I would admit also that I am biased to public opinion, unlike the U.S. government that tends to deal directly with leaders and assume that that's it. There is no other opinion in the Gulf. I'm more biased in the other direction. I feel U.S. policy has failed in many respects in the region because it doesn't care for listening to the Arab street per se, assuming that these types of reactionary societies do not have public opinion, but they do. Let me start with what could be described as the kind of understatement of the conference today by saying all is not well in the Gulf region today. I will even take it one step further and say, because of the nature of I guess our discussion this afternoon, I would say that all is not well in the region because all is not well in Washington. And the two are interrelated, and I will try to reflect on that a little bit in my remarks, and hopefully in the Q&A session to follow. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not bringing in anything new by telling you that today, as you and I meet here, we are witnesses basically, or we are witnessing a confused and very confusing policy, U.S. policy in the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf region. To be fair to all parties concerned, and as an old-timer dealing with U.S. foreign policy since the early 80s, I would say that this is not new. We've had that problem all along, although when you look at it today with this administration, the Trump era, if you will, U.S. policy seems to be shattering all kinds of Olympic records in this regard. Most of us, I hope, would agree with my humble assessment that U.S. policy on October 17, 2019 does lack today clarity, credibility, and trustworthiness, and that's the general impression right now. If you were to travel in the Gulf, that's what you would get from dealing with people, academics, businessmen, opinion makers, and even officials. Maybe I am at an advantage here because when I did travel in the past, dealing with leaders, and when I travel now, dealing with rank and file in the region, what you hear as a diplomat is totally different from what I hear as a fellow Arab American. We get the real thing because they feel we're one of them. We speak the language. The name is Arab. And so I've always enjoyed this discrepancy in comparing notes with diplomats, and I've made a habit for 40 years traveling in the region. Every time I go to a country, I meet with diplomats in that country, and I end up coming back after being briefed and debriefed before and after the trip. It's fascinating, that discrepancy that you see in talking to people in the region and what officialdom is getting. But when I say lack of clarity and credibility and trustworthiness, this is not necessarily just limited to people in the Gulf or to Arabs in general. It's actually spreading here. This week, to me, it's mind-boggling to see people who have served their country so high and so well, like the Mattises of this world, the Kellys of this world, the McMasters of this world, the John Allens of this world, regardless of how our commander-in-chief sees them as credible or not credible. Apparently, he has a problem with some of them as of this morning or last night. It is quite worrisome to hear somebody like John Allen says there is blood on Trump's hands for abandoning our Kurdish allies in a key political issue of the day. So when as a result of this kind of universal, if you will, animosity toward the policy or criticism of the policy, whether it's Syria today, but again, I mean, there were other issues yesterday, and I'm sure there will be other issues tomorrow, as it was just said. Syria is a passing kind of phase in this mix. And the bilateral U.S.-Arab relations today, ladies and gentlemen, are no longer deemed by our traditional partners in the region as added value. They used to be, but they are no longer added value. On the contrary, relations with Washington today have become, in many cases, a growing burden and a cause of concern even for our most closest allies in public. They are really having a hard time coping with some of the policies, some of the policy decisions that are being made as they pursue their own national interest, but more importantly to us as American citizens, as they pursue what we define here as the common interest between us as a country, the United States, and our allies in the region. So as Pickering said at lunch, this is spilling over and impacting some of the key issues in the region, whether you look at Yemen, whether you look at Iran, and the controversy of how to deal with Iran in the region, or whether you deal with the GCC crisis, which seems to have kind of been forgotten for a while, even though it's probably the most devastating item right now on the regional agenda, and of course being ignored by both our partners in the region and by us, because it has reached a stalemate. So reception in the region, look, frankly, I'm not, in watching the region very closely, I'm not seeing any lavish or ritzy celebration. I'm using ritzy here loosely. Please do not refer to the Ritz. But earlier this week, just to give you an example, one of what I consider probably the most informed Saudi personality on U.S.-Arab relations is Turki al-Faisal, who used to head the intelligence services in Saudi Arabia, American educated, studied in this town, degree from Georgetown, and probably I found him over the years, met with him dozens of times over the years, and found him to be probably the most informed Saudi official or Gulf official about U.S. policy. For him to reach the point of calling the policy this week, Monday, he called it contradictory. I'm using his word. That's Turki al-Faisal of Saudi Arabia, okay? A member of the royal family. He said, and I'm quoting, "The situation in Syria, we really don't know where the United States is. For example, is it in or is it out? For U.S. forces to all of a sudden fold up their tents and silently fade away, I think that's not the right thing to do," end of quote. This is the closest ally right now to the United States of America, and this is the fear that he is reflecting with regards to U.S. policy in the region. Yet, we have a president in the White House who sees his decision as brilliant strategy, or strategically brilliant, as he put it yesterday. And the resulting fallout from that brilliant decision has been desertion of allies, dereliction of responsibilities, and running away from publicly declared objectives shared with allies in the region that is causing, I think, very justified concern from Riyadh to Doha to Abu Dhabi, even to Tel Aviv. Thank you.
Hillel gets a brownie for being on time, although Professor Simon, you were also on time. Thank you. So for our final speaker of the day, we have Sheikh Abdullah Sabah, who can talk to us a little bit about how Russia is trying to capitalize on all of this chaos that U.S. policy is creating. While he gives his remarks, if you have questions, please write them and submit them up to the table, and I will try to get to them, as many of them as we have time before you all riot, because I'm keeping you away for your dinner. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I hope I'm going to be shorter than my two colleagues. I'm going to talk about...
It won't be hard.
I'm going to talk about the Russian influence in the Gulf and to what extent this will challenge the United States as the region's key security guarantor. Russia's fast becoming a key regional actor in the Middle East, quickly expanding its influence and exercising its power. This is a result of Vladimir Putin's vision to challenge the U.S. Dominant power in the global context, where in his eyes that the U.S. has overstretched its reach and abused its hegemony. As a matter of fact, historically speaking, during 1986, there was an incident in Kuwait during the Iraq-Iran war when the Iranian Navy attacked the Kuwaiti oil tankers. Kuwait immediately looked to seek help from the United States, which in the first stage Ronald Reagan refused. Then it shifted its policy toward the Soviet Union, in which the United States immediately came back and asked the Kuwaiti that they are willing to help. I think this is one of the examples that we can see that one of the options that the Gulf could reach is by expanding their superpowers allies, not only with the U.S., as it's in the decline now. In addition, Putin assures more than many events that the current global order or the world order is not in favor of the international community, in which it's the unipolars, it's the definition of the hegemonic power in the international community. Russia's trying to fill the vacuum of power from the US does not necessarily mean that the Gulf will move towards Russia. I think what the Gulf is trying to reassure to the United States that we are the most reliable allies to you, and what things have been done in Egypt, where the United States during the what's so-called the Arab Spring tried to influence or try to pressure more the Egyptian regime, in which, on the other hand, the Russian president and the Russian foreign policies tried to assure that we are the people who are going to stick with our allies. It's a message, I think, to the Gulf states and to the other allies of the United States. Moreover, I think the events have been this week and the past last week when the United States or President Trump abandoned the Kurdish allies. I think it's also a message that the Russians still, we are the most reliable allies to these kind of countries. I argue in my book that the strategic rise of Russia and its ambitious of regaining its hegemonic status, seeing that the Russian is not trying to expand their ideology, such as previously the Soviet Union when trying to expand the ideology of the communism. I think more it's building about the mutual interest between Russia and the other states. And I think when we saw the Russian new role in the Middle East, where Vladimir Putin last week, on Monday, visited Saudi Arabia, I think it's a message that we are more willing to take a further step towards our relations between the Gulf and the Russian Federation. I disagree with Dr. Khalil when he remarked that I think that despite the Gulf crisis, I think that the major GCC countries, except Oman, are willing to push forward or to have a boost on the Russian GCC relations. We have seen that King Salman visited Moscow, and His Highness Sheikh Sabah visited Moscow. Emir of Qatar, His Highness Sheikh Tamim, also visited Moscow, and the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. So I think this is the shift of the third phase of the shifting between the relations between the GCC, mainly Saudi Arabia, and the United States is after the Arab Spring 2011, in which the United States, or the relations between the United States and the GCC is being in a distrust venue. Finally, I would like to conclude that even the differences between Moscow and some GCC countries regarding the Iranian issue doesn't prevent the GCC or countries from supporting the transformation within the bilateral relations. So I think that to have more ally or in the international community is more beneficial to the GCC countries. And thank you.
Excellent. Well done. I think we'll have